It was the middle of 1816 when Percy Bysshe Shelley and his future wife Mary Godwin decided to take a summer holiday at Lord Byron's villa off the coast of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Their timing could not have been worse. Following the eruption of Mount Tambora the previous year, 1816 would come to be known as the Year Without a Summer, and due to the cold, miserable weather, the vacationers were forced to stay indoors and amuse themselves with German ghost stories. Lord Byron suggested a contest whereby they would each write their own ghost story, and thus, in the dreadful hours of the night, Mary Godwin, better known now by her married name Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, came up with the idea for Frankenstein. Not only is her novel often credited with launching the entire genre of science fiction, but it was an immediate cultural sensation. 5 years after its first publication, the famed dramatist Richard Peake adapted it into a stage play that took a few liberties with the source material. This play, and several others, saw constant revivals throughout the 19th century, and with the dawning of cinema at the start of the 20th, it wasn't long before Shelley's story was adapted for the screen.
Dr. Henry Frankenstein has uncovered the secret of life itself. With a stitched-together assemblage of human parts, he has created a new being, a creature that is as miraculous as it is terrible to behold. Frankenstein, horrified by what he's done, walks away from his work and hopes to start a new life with his fiancée Elizabeth. However, vilified for merely existing, the creature makes a violent escape and goes looking for his creator.
Before we go any further, if you could hit that like button, we could give this channel new life. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe as well. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. In 1931, Universal Studios, struggling with heavy losses during the early years of the Great Depression, struck gold with their release of Dracula in February, a movie that would earn nearly $750,000 in profit for the studio. The head of production at the time, Carl Laemmle Jr., immediately began pushing for more horror films, even as Carl Laemmle Sr., the owner and founder of the studio, was certain that Dracula had been nothing more than a fluke. Hoping for lightning to strike twice, Jr. Laemmle secured the rights to a recent British stage production of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was being performed by the same theater company that had done the Dracula play Universal had adapted for the screen. This stage version of Frankenstein, written by Peggy Webling, hadn't been as successful as the stage version of Dracula, but an American rewrite had been prepared by John L. Balderson for a run in New York, a run that was cancelled as a result of the deal with Universal. Shortly thereafter, Universal's Frankenstein was announced, with Dracula himself, Bela Lugosi, as its star. Lugosi wanted to play the titular Doctor, but the studio felt he'd have more draw as Frankenstein's monster, who, to be fair, is the real star of the story. Hoping to make the movie himself, the French writer-director Robert Fleuret met with Jr. Laemmle to discuss his plans for Frankenstein, and he managed to secure a contract, after which he was listed as the director in what may or may not have been an official capacity. Fleuret brought in Garrett Fort, who had helped on the script for Dracula, and the two wrote the first draft of a screenplay together. There was considerable debate as to who contributed what to this screenplay, a bitter argument that the two men carried to their graves, but regardless of how it came together, it took its cues from the Balderson rewrite of the Webling play. This version of the story was bleak, with practically everyone dying in the end and the monster portrayed as a soulless, unsympathetic beast. While it was pretty far removed from Shelley's novel, it did maintain a lot of the ideas and Frankenstein mythology that had evolved over a century of stage adaptations, including giving Frankenstein a bumbling servant named Fritz and turning Frankenstein's creature into a mute. It's unclear what exactly happened when this script was turned in, but Fleuret found himself in the hot seat when the papers began announcing that Frankenstein was on hold and that a new director was being sought. Perhaps desperate to prove his talents, Fleuret then filmed 20 minutes of test footage. This footage, now lost, featured Bela Lugosi in costume as the monster, looking more like the Golem than the monster we all know today, as well as fellow Dracula alumni Edward Van Sloan and Dwight Frye as Dr. Valtman and the assistant Fritz, respectively. Fleury wanted to take inspiration from German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Metropolis. It wasn't enough, though, and both Fleury and Lugosi were moved off of Frankenstein and onto Murders in the Rue Morgue, which subsequently flopped and ended Fleury's career with the studio. Junior was determined to get Frankenstein made, however, so he had to find a new monster and a new director. Enter James Whale. Whale was an English stage veteran who dabbled heavily in acting, set design, and directing. In Hollywood, he made a name for himself with a screen adaptation of his own stage production of Journey's End, a World War I melodrama featuring an electric performance by the actor Colin Clive. The Laemmles put Whale under contract, and, around the time Fleury was struggling to maintain control over Frankenstein, James Whale was directing another World War I drama called Waterloo Bridge, starring Mae Clarke. Before Waterloo Bridge was even finished, the Laemmles knew that they had a massive hit on their hands, and Whale rocketed to prominence as one of their finest directors. There are two different versions of how Whale became attached to Frankenstein. According to studio history, Whale was given 50 potential scripts to work on, and he enthusiastically picked Frankenstein because he wanted to see if he could make the unbelievable believable and get away from being typecast as a director of war pictures. According to Whale, however, he was, quote, forced more or less against his will, unquote, but quickly became intrigued by the thematic possibilities of Shelley's original novel. Whale's key realization when comparing Fleury and Fort's script with Shelley's book was that in the book, it is easier to sympathize and relate to the creature, that he is a fully fledged character and not a simple brute. Wanting to inject pathos for the monster back into the story, Whale worked with Garrett Fort and yet another writer, Francis Edwards Farrago, to complete the final script. Though the studio was keen on Leslie Howard to play Dr. Frankenstein, Whale preferred his longtime collaborator Colin Clive. Clive does deliver an incredible performance as the Doctor, walking a fine line between unhinged madness and cool scientific passion. He probably pulled from his own internal struggles for the performance, as Colin Clive was a notorious alcoholic prone to bouts of self-destruction, and his severe alcohol addiction, combined with tuberculosis, eventually cut his life short at the age of 37. For the female lead, Frankenstein's fiancée Elizabeth, Bette Davis was initially chosen, but Junior Laemmle passed on her, citing a lack of sex appeal. Instead, the role went to Mae Clarke. In addition to her role in Whale's Waterloo Bridge, Clarke also starred in Public Enemy in 1931, in which she is the memorable recipient of a grapefruit to the face by James Cagney. Both Edward Van Sloan and Dwight Fry were kept on as Dr. Waldman and Fritz, and Frederick Kerr, another veteran of Waterloo Bridge, was brought on as Frankenstein's father, the Baron. As the original date to start filming passed, however, there was still a significant missing player, as nobody had yet been hired to play the monster. According to Hollywood lore, Whale saw the obscure character actor Boris Karloff eating lunch in the commissary and immediately knew that he fit the part. Bela Lugosi, however, claims that he suggested Karloff after being tasked with finding his own replacement, while alternatively, Whale's partner, David Lewis, claimed that he came up with Karloff. While there are good reasons to doubt each of these accounts, it is true that, somehow and somewhere, Whale and Karloff met for an informal audition in which Whale hired him on the spot, based not only on his appearance, but also his easy manner, friendly smile, and British heritage. Boris Karloff, at 44 years old, was thrilled to have a big break, even if it was playing a mute monster, but the job was more trying than he probably expected. For starters, his costume was designed to bulk up his body, both in height and girth, and it was weighed down with heavy boots and metal rods that would allow him to lean forward and lurch. All told, it weighed about 48 pounds. Filming was done in the humidity of late summer, too, so the thick, black clothes were anything but cooling. The makeup work, put together by Jack Pierce, who had previously worked on The Man Who Laughs and Dracula, took 4 hours to apply every morning, and this was in the days before foam latex. Whale and Pierce wanted the head to be built up to suggest the brutish insertion of the brain, and this was done with a time-consuming application of layer upon layer of caustic collodion and cotton. Karloff's face was also painted with greenish-gray paint, which made him look unnaturally pale in black and white, which somehow translated to the film's color posters, which is why Frankenstein's monster often looks green. Karloff happily took advantage of a bridge in his upper right jaw, too, removing it and sucking in his cheek to give it a trademark sunken look. Finally, mortician's wax was placed over his eyelids to conceal the actor's large, expressive eyes. All of the makeup took an additional 2 hours to remove, so at the height of filming, Karloff spent about as much time every day in the makeup chair as he did sleeping. Rumors abound that, for whatever reason, James Whale was unnecessarily cruel to Boris Karloff, and made him repeat a particularly demanding scene in which Karloff carries Colin Clive up a hill and onto a ladder over and over again, resulting in extensive damage to the actor's back, despite the back brace that was fitted into his costume. Even if Whale had no malicious intent, it is true that Boris Karloff suffered permanent injury from his 3 stints as Frankenstein's monster, resulting in 3 separate back surgeries later in life that could never fully alleviate his chronic pain. With Whale retaining his crew from Waterloo Bridge, the film was shot more or less in sequence in and around the Universal lot, with this notorious scene filmed at Lake Sherwood in the Santa Monica Mountains. The actress playing Little Maria, Marilyn Harris, in a case of life imitating art, was completely unafraid of Boris Karloff in his full costume and makeup, even riding with him to the location and asking about the electrodes in his neck. She'd only had a handful of swimming lessons, and in the first take of the scene where the monster throws her in the water, she stayed afloat. Exasperated, Whale had to bribe her with whatever she wanted in order to get another take, and after Harris successfully stayed under for long enough to complete the shot, she asked for a dozen hard-boiled eggs, much to the annoyance of her overbearing and abusive mother, who kept her on a strict diet. Whale later sent the young girl 2 dozen eggs. The scene was trimmed for several audiences and for all of its re-releases until the 80s, cut after the monster reaches for Maria, but before we see him throw her in the water. This cut actually makes the scene even more horrifying, as the creature's actions with the little girl are left to the audience's imagination. Whale stuck with Fleury's German expressionist inspirations and built his sets, lights, and camera angles with that in mind. He reportedly screened the cabinet of Dr. Caligari several times in preparation. He also used a lot of camera movements and experimental cuts that were unusual for the time period, giving the picture an intensity and unease that are hard to overstate. While he struck relatively close to the script, a few scenes were changed or added during production. This scene, for example, which fleshes out the human side of Dr. Frankenstein, may have been written by Whale himself.
You never wanted to look beyond the clouds and the stars, or to know what causes the trees to bud?
Fearing accusations of blasphemy for its thematic material, an introduction was placed at the start of the film in which an out-of-character Edward Van Sloan warns the audience about the salaciousness of the movie they're about to watch. Lastly, after a worrisome test screening, an epilogue was appended to the film in which it is made clear that Frankenstein survives. Note that, though they were able to get actors Frederick Kerr and Mae Clark to come back for the reshoot, that guy on the bed is most definitely not Colin Clive, who was on a boat to Europe at the time. The movie released in November of 1931 to critical acclaim and commercial success. Against a total budget of just under $300,000, it earned $1.4 million in theater rentals, which amounted to over $700,000 in total profit for the studio. Karloff became an overnight superstar, and James Whale would become something of a household name in horror. There was considerable controversy surrounding the film, with cuts made in several states and with some international markets like Ireland and Italy banning it outright. In addition to the Little Maria scene, censors almost universally attacked Frankenstein's line,
"In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God."
During the production code enforcement years, starting in 1934, these cuts became permanent in all markets until an uncut version of the film was found in the British National Film Archives in the early 80s. In my opinion, 1931's Frankenstein is an almost perfect film that is superior in many ways to Shelley's original novel, which I have to admit I find unbearably dull in style. The movie captures all of the thematic depth and philosophical questions posed by the novel in a compact, thrilling form, clocking in at a mere 71 minutes. Frankenstein derives from an old archetype, to be sure. Even Shelley acknowledges that in her alternate title, The Modern Prometheus, but it hits a psychological nerve that is both disturbing to touch and fascinating to probe. Frankenstein is concerned with creating life from lifelessness, to borrow a phrase, and deals with all manner of moral and ethical complications that come with such power. These would be boiled down in the opening scene of the sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, to the story of a man who tried to touch the power of God and got punished for it. But I think that's an oversimplification. Frankenstein, the character, does indeed fly too close to the sun and throw dirt in the face of death, but the film and novel also take great pains to show the humanity of his creature, and how the creature's persecution leads to violence. This is a narrative thread that most of the earlier stage plays had long since dropped, but which is absolutely essential to the tale. I tend to look at Frankenstein, therefore, as a story about consequences, about nature and nurture. The movie pulls us in both directions, with the abnormal brain, a brand new addition to the mythos, hinting at the possibility that the creature was always destined to be a villain, but Karloff's brilliantly delivered innocence pouring through and making us feel that if he'd been treated with kindness instead of fear, things would have turned out differently. It is for all of these reasons that Frankenstein has endured as an archetypal story that is resurrected again and again. I'm sure I'll discuss the film's sequel and maybe other adaptations in future videos, but for my money, 1931's Frankenstein is the best version of the story. James Whale deserves most of the credit, of course, as he is one of the great unsung heroes of early Hollywood, a filmmaking genius on the same level as John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, Fritz Lang, and Orson Welles. He gives the film its thick atmosphere and lurid style, its unsettling tone and theatrical flourishes. He did things no one else would think of, like having a microphone inside the coffin while the gravediggers are burying it. If this film had been made by anyone else, it probably would have failed. Unfortunately, when the Laemmles lost control of Universal in 1936, due in part to mismanagement of James Whale's Showboat, Whale's career went into steep decline and was all but over by the end of the decade. After a series of strokes and medical complications in the early 50s, James Whale committed suicide, worried that his work would be forgotten. Let's make sure that never happens.
It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Let me know in the comments which Universal monster you love the most. While you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you really do like these videos, consider joining my Patreon to get early access, your name in the credits, and more. My patrons get to vote on one movie I cover every single month. You can also check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of several more sci-fi classics in both film and literature, including reviews of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and a few of its adaptations. Until next time, though, when we'll go to great lengths to make a long-distance phone call, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Quite a good scene, isn't it? One man crazy, three very sane spectators.